Hello, everybody. Happy Monday, and welcome back to the digital edition of NHL Now. It's just Jackie Redmond and EJ Raddick today.
Yeah.
No guest on a Monday, but you know what? We actually have some pretty cool stuff to talk about today because on this date in history, we'll start in 2011. A pretty epic series between the Bruins and the Canucks comes to a close in Game 7. And EJ, I think I understood this correctly before the show. That's the only Stanley Cup final you haven't been to in a very long time.
Yeah, that was the only one. I was actually working on the studio in New York during that season and or during that final, so I was not there. But I've been at every other one going back into the 1990s. So it does stand out a little bit for me because it was a different experience. But for the Boston Bruins, though, Jackie, I mean, that was a team that had to overcome a lot of obstacles along the way. I mean, they had 3 7-game series, and they found ways to beat the Canadiens in the first round. That was in overtime. Think about that. Overtime, Game 7 in round 1. Nothing may have happened. You lose that game. Then they were in Game 7 against the Tampa Bay Lightning in the Eastern Conference Final. And then, of course, in Game 7 against the Vancouver Canucks. That one on the road in Vancouver. And Tim Thomas was a huge difference in that Game 7. 37 saves en route to the Cup victory and a Conn Smythe victory for Tim Thomas.
It was a good year for Tim Thomas back in
Yes,
2011. And I love that Boston Bruins team because it's the example now that we always go back to, especially when we talk about the Lightning and their devastating loss last year. I always reference the Boston Bruins because the year before 2011, they were up 3-0 on the Philadelphia Flyers. They blow that series lead, and then they blow a 3-goal lead in Game 7 of that series to lose. It just goes to show that, you know, you can be a great team, you can have a devastating loss, an embarrassing loss really, and then come back the next year and learn from that and just be stronger for it. And I feel like they are like a classic example of that. You have to lose before you can win.
Yeah, that was just a heartbreaking loss. You know, the interesting thing about that series against the Flyers in 2010 was they lost David Krejci, I believe, in Game 3 of that series, and that's when things begin to shift. The Philadelphia Flyers got a little healthier, and they ended up grabbing the momentum. And like you point out, in Game 7, they were the Bruins were down 3-0, were leading 3-0. Flyers were able to rally and win that game 4-3. So it was definitely not a great feeling, I'm sure, for the Boston Bruins after that year. The interesting thing to note, though, is Tim Thomas was not the goalie of that year. He had been injured, and it was a tough year for Tim Thomas in 2010 because he had injury issues. He was looking forward after a really good season in 2009 to maybe being the starting goaltender at the Olympics for Team USA. It just didn't play out with injuries. He was a member of that Olympic team in 2010, but he was really not the goalie. It was Ryan Miller of the Buffalo Sabres at the time. So, really, things were different for the Bruins the following year, and Tim Thomas was a big part of that.
And the other thing that we have to talk about when we bring up that 2011 series is that this is pre-Twitter famous Roberto Luongo. Like, this is before we really knew how funny and hilarious Roberto Luongo was. He was always like pretty serious. And in that series, I remember too, you know, was pretty serious during his media availability. And I believe that was the year he had the famous, well, I don't see him pumping my tires, quote referencing Tim Thomas.
Yeah, you know, it was a little bit earlier in Roberto's career. You know, if you were around Roberto, he was still the same guy, but he didn't have this, obviously, a social media to kind of really – yeah, exactly. So it was a little bit different. And, you know, he used to talk about going and taking walks to the seawall in Vancouver to kind of get his thoughts together. But that was a really tough loss for the Vancouver Canucks. You think about it, in that year, they had a great season. They won the first 2 games of the series. Things looked great for them. And then they went to Boston, and the doors just fell off for the Canucks. They got outscored 12-1 by the Bruins in Games 3 and 4, 8-1 loss in Game 3. Bruins got back in the series. They traded wins on home ice in Games 5 and 6, and then the Bruins were able to break through on the road, winning in Vancouver 4-0. Bergeron and Marchand each had a pair of goals, and as I mentioned, Tim Thomas had 37 saves in that game to get the shutout victory. And, you know, he had a .940 save percentage in that playoff run. So he was something special.
I hear that's pretty good. But there's another series we wanted to talk about as well that also came to a close on this date in history. And that was back in 2015. The Blackhawks defeating the Lightning in Game 6 to win the Stanley Cup that year. What do you remember about that series? What kind of springs to your memory first?
Well, it's funny because you think of the Blackhawks and you think of the Lightning and you think about scoring and offense. And in the last 4 games of that series, there was no more than 3 goals scored. I believe the games were like 2-1, 2-0, 2-1, like those kind of games. So it was really, really low scoring. The thing that comes to mind also is that Ben Bishop was injured, a very young Vasilevsky had to go in. Andrei Vasilevsky had to go in for the Tampa Bay Lightning and played very well in a losing effort in one of the games. So those are the things that come to mind right away. I know that Chicago was able to steal Game 1 in Tampa. I can remember being there, and there was a lot of Chicago Blackhawk fans in the crowd at Amalie Arena for that game. And, it went back and forth. Tampa was able to get a 2-1 series lead, but then Chicago was able to dial it up and get the job done. And Duncan Keith, who won the Conn Smythe that year, he had a terrific playoffs, and he was a difference maker for sure, as he usually is for the Hawks.
And a reminder, too, that the Lightning, I know not the exact same team, but some core players of the Tampa Bay Lightning have been knocking on this door for quite some time. I mean, that was only 5 years ago. And so they seem like a team that, the Washington Capitals were pre-Stanley Cup win, which is a really solid team every single year in the playoffs and just haven't really been able to go all the way, though they've come close a few times.
Yeah, they've been to a couple of conference finals. I mean, again, they were in 2011. They were right there in Game 7 against the Boston Bruins. They lost 1-0 at the TD Garden in that Game 7. Dwayne Rollison was the goalie for the Lightning at that time and was terrific. I think he made 37 saves in a 1-0 loss. But, yeah, you're right. They've been close. Eastern Conference Finals a couple of times, a Stanley Cup final loss. They've changed some of the personnel, but there's a number of guys that were part of that team in 2015 that are still looking to kind of get over the hump. But for the Hawks, another interesting run, though, Jackie, because you go back to the first round against the Nashville Predators in that season, they really struggled out of the gate because Corey Crawford couldn't find his game. Remember, Scott Darling had to come in and replace Corey Crawford on a couple of occasions, and he was a difference maker early in that series. He ended up getting the starts in games 3, 4, 5, and 6, I believe. And then in Game 6, he was pulled and Crawford went back in, and the rest, as they say, is history. They were able to beat Nashville in 6 games. They had a contentious series in the Western Final against the Anaheim Ducks, won that one in 7 games, and had to rally to do that. They were down 3-2 and found a way to win it. That was a great, let's face it, that Chicago team, that's probably the team of the decade of the 2010s, winning 3 Stanley Cups in what, 5 years?
Oh, I would say that that's a safe bet to call them the team of the decade. They look quite different than that team in 2015 than they do this year when we saw them play, but they're going to have a shot here because they're one of the 24 teams. Do you think just because of the experience of the core players on that team that they have a shot at maybe surprising us in this?
Yeah, I think they got a puncher's chance because of that, and also because of the guy I mentioned, Corey Crawford. I mean, he's one of those guys, Jackie, and we saw it during that Cup run. He can overcome some adversity and find his way again. Now, we know it's been several years. He's had some injury issues, but he's rested. And if he can get into training camp, and if we get into this would be thrilling 2014 playoff chase, he's someone that can make a difference for the Chicago Blackhawks. And, of course, they have Taves and Kane and Keith still. And I think experience will matter in a scenario that no one has really been in before. So we will see. But, I give him a shot. I mean, it will be hard against an Edmonton Oilers team that's loaded with McDavid and Draisaitl and is playing very well on special teams. But, when you have veteran players like that in a short series, I mean, anything's possible.
Especially after the layoff that we've had the last 2 months for these guys. It's tough to know what to expect, and the Stanley Cup playoffs are always, I feel like a broken record, but they're always wild, they're always unpredictable, and there's always a team that nobody thinks is going to do very much that goes on a little bit of a run. So I'm sure there'll be a couple of those this year because it just seems set up for chaos. And honestly, I hope it is chaotic because I think, hockey fans are obviously starved for hockey. I mean, what better way to bring it back than to just have complete madness in these play-in rounds? I can't wait. I mean, the clock is ticking, I hope. And hopefully we'll get to see how this all plays out very soon. But it was nice to go down memory lane a little bit each. A good way to start off the week.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Hawks and Bruins, 2 great original 6 teams.
Big time. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.